Good morning and welcome to this week's programme, in which we hear from the archives some of the legacy of the late Liam Cosgrave, Taoiseach, 1973 to 1977. His roots in politics, his family tradition stretching back to 1798, his father W.T. Cosgrave's role in 1916, his father's emergence as the first leader of an independent Irish government, and what it was like for the young Liam Cosgrave growing up in the 1920s. His own political career from 1943, how he saw the difference between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, what he learned from working in Costello's two inter-party governments of the 1940s and 1950s, how he applied that lesson in his 1973-77 coalition government, and John A. Murphy on how he reckoned Hall's pictorial weekly weakened that Cosgrave government in the 1977 general election. We begin this morning with this excerpt from Michael Campion and Andy O'Mahony's series Na Taoiseach, the edition covering Liam Cosgrave as Taoiseach in the 1970s. The first speaker was the press secretary to that 1973-77 government, Murish McAneil.
I think the opening and the first and last dinner that President De Valera gave to the incoming government in the Phoenix Park, Mr De Valera at the dinner gave an extraordinary speech advising all the members of the government to be loyal to the Taoiseach, that on this rock they would fall otherwise, and addressed it. He said, "You know where I stand on the matter of coalition governments myself." After he'd lectured the Taoiseach and the government on the improbability of a coalition survival, Mr Cosgrave got up, the Taoiseach, and said, "President De Valera, I wish you and Ban De Valera every good wishes on your retirement."
Man, a few words. But Cosgrave did have the loyalty of his ministers, didn't he?
Absolutely.
He did. He unquestionably had the loyalty.
Barry Desmond of Labour.
And it was very much the tradition of the party giving absolute loyalty to Liam Cosgrave, and they gave it in full measure. Now, Garrett and he hadn't got on at all together, but Garrett, meanwhile, was making a magnificent career in foreign affairs, was becoming a star at international level, and was setting himself out for the next bound of leadership. So Garrett, to that extent, benefited
and was the only one
from
mentioned by Cosgrave in
the interesting was Cosgrave and Fitzgerald had huge tensions before they went into government.
Stephen Collins of the Irish Times.
And there have been tensions between Labour and Fine Gael before they went into government. When they all went in, they all gelled, and I think it is the personality of Cosgrave and Brendan Corish, but Cosgrave's own quiet demeanour. I think he managed to get all these, some of the very bright people like Conor Cruiser Bryan, Gareth Fitzgerald, they all gelled in the government, and there wasn't really any disloyalty. There was no leaking by one side against the other, and it was remarkable, I think, in terms of the unity the two parties showed. And they went into the 77 election together. They fought it as a government. They sought re-election.
His resigning within a week, Morris, no surprise, I suppose, in that.
Well, it was a huge surprise to everybody at the time, and James Dillon had done the same thing a few years earlier, but James retired not as a former Taoiseach, but as somebody who had failed in 2 elections to get his party into power, was at a certain age, and I think Liam Cosgrave took everybody by surprise.
What age? He was 56?
He was still a very young man, but he had been in politics since 1943. He had a very full career. He'd been a parliamentary secretary, he'd been a minister, he'd been a Taoiseach, and unless he wanted to spend the next 4 years fighting in opposition to bring his party back in 1981,
he must have felt that others were waiting in the wings. He must have felt,
of course he did, and it would have been the case. There would have been a leadership contest within a year or two.
Liam Cosgrave believed that his experience in the 1948-51 inter-party government, and again in John A. Costello's second government, 1954 to 1957, had taught him valuable lessons.
The first coalition in 1948 was remarkable for many things. There were 5 political parties and 12 independents. Now, although they, as I said earlier, supported the government of the day, many of them were almost as much opposed to each other as they were to Fianna Fáil. But as I said, they had one thing in common: as long as they voted right, I was happy with them. Now, later in the 1954 government, it was mainly ourselves and Labour. There was small representation from the then Clonard Loon party, and then of course in 1973 it was Fine Gael and Labour again. I think the experience of the first coalition was of value in the subsequent ones, because it enabled me to gain a very considerable experience of different people, and the experience I had of whipping so many diverse groups and indeed different individuals, and helped me when in 1973 we had only a majority of 2, and the experience of dealing with people so diverse in outlook in the earlier years was naturally of value when it came to keeping the government going. And one of the achievements, I think, of the period 1973 to 77 was that we had a very harmonious relationship between Fine Gael and Labour, and between the individual members of the government as well as the individual members of the 2 parties.
But those individuals were attracting attention, some of it unwelcome attention. For instance, they were stars of Frank Hall's television programme, Hall's Pictorial Weekly.
A programme with great satirical bite, and I would think on the whole its effect was damaging.
This is the view of historian John A. Murphy, himself an NUI senator during this period, so a frequenter of Leinster House at the time.
If you remember the individual depictions of individual ministers, they were described in terms of, not to put too fine a point on it, lechery or greed or begrudgery. The characteristics that were satirised were in themselves very unattractive, and so I would think it was very damaging to a young electorate, which in any case regarded this government as fuddy-duddy establishment.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure for me to come here this evening to say a few words in favour of Hall's Pictorial Weekly.
This is Liam Morrissey from the archives of Hall's Pictorial Weekly, and this is his characterisation of Liam Cosgrave as Taoiseach.
As you know, Mr. Hall, or Frank as I call him in private, missed no opportunity to give me a bit of publicity on the show. I owe it all to him that I became such a popular figure with the general public. Sometimes it was a bit embarrassing. Indeed, I asked him to lay off several times. People are beginning to talk, I told him. But he wouldn't hear it, no. No minister, he said, he always treated me with great respect, which is more than some of his colleagues could say. Or mine either. No minister, says he, I am determined to see that you get what is coming to you. And Mr. Hall is a man of his word. I often thought I got more than was coming to me, but there was no stopping him, though God knows I did my best. His enemies and mine said I paid him to do it, but he never took a single penny.
Back to Andy O'Mahony's programme in the series Na Taoiseach, these verdicts on Liam Cosgrave from Barry Desmond and from Murish Mochaneal.
How will he be remembered, Murish?
Well, I think his work in relation to Northern Ireland will be remembered, his work at Sunningdale, his leadership of a government which he led actually by having a profound sense of humour. And he used that humour in particular, and was replicated by many of those who worked with him, but particularly by the young minister whom he called Michael O'Leary, whom on one occasion he found imitating him in the cabinet room to his humour. He was like an elderly headmaster.
Yes.
And the curious thing was he had a tremendous feeling for all the members of that government, and was one of the finest storytellers of political stories I have ever heard.
Oh yeah, particularly in Dunleary, and I was with him for 20 years in Dunleary. After a few paddies up in Glenalbin, Liam Cosgrave really began to open up, and one would see a side of a man which wasn't in fact as taciturn or as abrasive at all as well. But the thing I wanted to remember him particularly on was his great humanity. I know that when David Thornley was dying, Liam Cosgrave went to see him with great regularity and great solace. And it continued on afterwards. When Brendan Cores was very seriously ill, he went down to see Phyllis. When Richie Ryan had a very bad accident in recent years, he went down regularly to Richie Ryan. He always regarded this as part of... When Frank Cluskey was very seriously ill, Liam Cosgrave went to see him on a very regular basis. Unannounced, no fanfare, a man who really did live up to the huge spirituality that the man had.
He was born to be a politician. He was born in 1920. His father led the Irish governments. He was president of the Executive Council of the Irish Free State from 1922 to 1932.
Well, the antecedents came from a place called Graigmore, Kilrush in North Wexford.
And his family had earlier political connections, as he told Colin Murray.
And a member of the family was shot dead by the yeoman in 1798 in Carnew. The family then got split up, and as far as I know, two of them, a son and a daughter, went to Castledermot in County Kildare, and that's where my grandfather came from, Thomas Cosgrave.
he came to Dublin and he had a public house in James Street. He was a member of the Poor Law Guardians at the time, and James Street, as you know, had the South Dublin Union right opposite the public house, which is now St James's Hospital. And the South Dublin Union was the place where the 4th Battalion of the Volunteers fought in 1916 under Eamon Kent. My father was a member of that. He was a lieutenant at the time.
Father and your uncle were now sentenced to death and immediately after the rising.
They were, that's right. They were court-martialed in what was the Richmond Barracks. Afterwards, now, it became Keogh Barracks, and it's now Keogh Square in Inchicore. A number of them were tried there. You see, it was where the court-martials were held. My father had been a member of the Dublin Corporation for Sinn Féin, Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin, and he was chairman of the Finance Committee, even though they had a small number, but he was appointed chairman, I think, in 1915, and he was chairman until he had to retire in 1922.
Did your father ever speak to you, Liam, at any time about the, in the immediate aftermath of the rising, about the odium and the disdain and even the sheer contempt in which many of the rebels were held by the ordinary people of Dublin of the time?
I always understood from what they said that it was the executions which turned the people. The British government, as you know, executed all the leaders and a few others as well, because they executed John McBride, who wasn't one of the he was prominent because he'd been in the South African War and he was well known, but all the leaders were executed, and then a series of protests in the House of Commons and throughout the world, of course, at it, and that changed the public perception.
Liam Cosgrave took a close interest in that political period, and he always expressed his indebtedness to his father.
My own father, as an Irish nationalist, worked in his time on these problems.
Here he is in 1976, addressing the joint sessions of Congress in Washington.
In his generation, an independent, democratic Irish state came into being and took its place in the modern world. He and his generation had to cope from the outset with what I have just described as the most difficult task for those who proclaim independence in the name of a people: the establishment of a durable democratic institutions on a solid basis of consent, so that freedom is not simply proclaimed but is actually achieved. They did this well. The democratic structures they established in Ireland are solidly based on the will of the people.
I should say he never looked for anything for himself, either then or afterwards.
From Colm Murray's interview, Liam Cosgrave talking about his father.
And when Griffith died, he replaced Collins as acting chairman of the provisional government, and Collins was involved in the army in the Civil War. Then Collins was killed, and he took over, and that was it. He never looked for anything for himself, and he never, as I might say, blew his own trumpet or got anyone else to blow it for him.
And on the occasion of his father's death in 1966, I asked Liam Cosgrave about his father's emergence as leader of the Irish Free State government in the summer of 1922, at the start of the Civil War, after the death of Arthur Griffith and the immediate assassination of Michael Collins.
Well, I asked him once how did he come to be selected, and he said that he looked around him at the time, and it happened that he was older than most of his colleagues, that he had a longer public experience because he'd been a member of the Dublin Corporation from 1909 and was chairman of the Finance Committee, which gave him considerable administrative experience, that in the circumstances, while he did not aspire either then or at any other time to any particular office, he felt that it was a duty that devolved upon him, and in that spirit he accepted it. He was entirely devoid of any personal or political ambitions. His life as a young man had been not easy because his father died when he was 9, and he had to undertake the responsibility of not only earning his own living but helping his family to overcome the difficulties which any family encounters where the parent dies young. I think that probably the factor that affected him most in 1916 was the
death of his stepbrother, who was accidentally shot in the South Dublin Union. He also, of course, suffered the death of his brother Phil, who was a TD and who also fought in Marrowbone Lane with Mr. Joseph McGrath. He died in 1922, and at the same time an uncle of his was shot and died subsequently. All these personal tragedies certainly affected his nature, but he had a very philosophical approach to life, and while he felt like anyone else would the great sorrows which these deaths of close relatives, he nevertheless faced life on a very practical and in many ways pragmatical basis. Although he had a mild and unpretentious manner, there was a rather tough streak in him which displayed itself when required, and that streak went very deep in his character.
Back to Colm Murray's interview of 2011, he spoke to Liam Cosgrave about his boyhood, about growing up as the son of W.T. Cosgrave.
For the young Liam Cosgrave, who was now just growing up in the Ireland of the 1920s, what was the sense like at home, family life, with W.T. Cosgrave being effectively the boss?
Well, family life was normal insofar as one could describe conditions as normal there, but later, after the murder of Kevin O'Higgins, we had a military guard on the house. He was guarded when he was driven anywhere, and that remained until he went out of office.
And here is W.T. Cosgrave calling the 1932 general election.
I have just tendered to His Excellency the Governor-General advice to dissolve the Oireachtas and to summon the new Oireachtas for the 2nd of March. The rights and liberties secured by the treaty must be preserved. The fullest possible advantage must be taken of our membership of the British Commonwealth of Nations and of our proximity to the British market. The government party is the one party in this country which can secure for the people political and economic salvation.
Was there a sense of his being a remote figure as far as you were concerned? Did you have access to him,
Oh, yes, plenty of access. We used to enjoy walks together and hunted together, raced together, and of course went to some political meetings together.
At this stage, your own particular interest in politics was forming.
Yeah, well, I suppose it was.
Were you aware all this time as you were growing up, though you would only have been 6, I think, at the time, of the rise of shall we say, the political split between your father and the likes of Eamon de Valera, the birth of Fianna Fáil and the inexorable rise politically of Fianna Fáil?
Well, of course, it's all a long time ago. I remember, politics, was, shall we say, fairly robust at the time, and that's a word they use sometimes about football matches.
Exactly, yeah. Robust it may have been, but for the Cosgrave family, it surely must have been a seismic change, the transfer of power in the atmosphere of the Ireland of 1932.
Oh yeah, well, it was carried out very peacefully. Of course, the Dáil was well established, and I suppose that election, maybe more than any other, proved that the ballot was stronger than the bullet, and the people backed it with great courage and tenacity, and the state has survived ever since.
W.T. Cosgrave deserves Professor Joseph Lee's tribute, that Cosgrave would do the ship of state one final service by the manner in which he quietly left the bridge and handed over the wheel to the rival captain, bitter though it was in party terms. Indeed, precisely because it was so bitter in party terms, it was his finest hour.
Peace can be secured only on the basis of the goodwill of people towards each other. And is it not evident that there can be no goodwill when men see the things that mean most to them in life, things that transcend life itself, being attacked?
I remember once reading in Tim Pat Coogan's Life of De Valera a very interesting comment. Some weeks after he assumed office as Taoiseach, he called some of his senior ministers like Aiken, Ryan, McEntee around him, and he was talking about WT's government and the first decade of the birth of the state, and he said, gentlemen, he said, they were magnificent. They were magnificent. Such was his admiration for the work that they had done in creating the various offices of the state. I don't know if you were ever aware of that tribute from him.
I've heard that quote from the book, but it's a little hard to accept it in the sense that there were opportunities later to say that, and it was never said. And I'd always question the phraseology used there. Maybe it was, but it was never said by anyone afterwards. In fact, the only major contribution, and it was a very generous one, was when my father died, Lamass spoke in the Dáil, and that was very different to anything that had been said before. And I was always glad to acknowledge that, and did so in the Dáil at the time.
As is evident in the RTE sound archive, Liam Cosgrave much preferred talking about his father's career than his own. But shortly after his retirement from politics, Rodney Rice persuaded him to reflect on his own career, beginning with his election as a 23-year-old TD in 1943.
As I say, I've spent my life in politics, and in the early years up to 1948 and even up to 1973, it was a long haul because our party had dropped to as low as 30 deputies the year I was elected. Between that and 1948, due to debts, we had gone down as low as 25, so that it took quite an effort to build it up over the years. It was hard work both in my own constituency, in the Dáil and in the country, but we never ceased to make the effort, and after a long time we succeeded in getting the party into office, and as you know, since then it has grown to its present numbers. It was a great privilege to work with so many dedicated people who devoted themselves to the public service and who rendered very distinguished service to the country and very faithful service.
What were the key differences, do you think, between Fine Gael down through the years and Fianna Fáil, because both of them come from that same Sinn Féin and to an extent populist background?
I think probably the main difference was Fianna Fáil seemed to me always to put the party first. I think Fine Gael definitely always put the country first, and the people that were involved in it were people who sought nothing from the state other than to serve. That applied to ordinary supporters who worked very hard, and as you can imagine, when the numbers had dropped, it was very difficult to keep an organisation going, and while you can keep an organisation of a certain kind going, it requires both support, financial, and votes from the people. Well, you can win elections without money, but you can't win them without votes.
And let's pause at this point and hear Liam Cosgrave, the professional politician, at work. Almost 4 decades later, he cracks the same joke. It was one he was very fond of. In 2014, when he was donating his father's papers to the Royal Irish Academy.
You can win elections without money, but you can't win them without votes.
Back to the Rodney Rice interview.
The people who supported Fine Gael and the deputies of the party were very disinterested, anxious to serve the country, and I believe served in a very generous, wholehearted way the true interests of the nation.
Would that have been more identifiable to the people if the parties, not just Fine Gael but also Fianna Fáil, had been more ideologically based?
Initially, I would imagine that they had the same ideology, in the sense that both, as you mentioned, were part of what was the old Sinn Féin organisation, who derived their inspiration from the writings of Arthur Griffith, who, as you know, founded Sinn Féin. Subsequently then they parted at the time of the Civil War, and since then, of course, economic and social problems naturally have dominated the issue, with the exception of the problem of partition in the north of Ireland, because naturally running a country is a different thing to running a political organisation, and the Sinn Féin doctrine in the earlier years was designed to secure Irish independence. Once independence was secured and the state was established, then the task was to organise the state and the institutions of state and the country as a whole, economically, socially, culturally and so on. That's a different operation towards the propaganda and the effort that was necessary prior to the establishment of the state. I suppose only historians can decide whether the efforts made were successful or not. I think in many ways they were successful.
Do you see a continuity all the way from your father's time to your own and then on up to the present, or do you see the party changing dramatically with passing time?
Well, of course, every year or every period is different, but basically the traditions of Fine Gael are the same as they always were. That is, service to the state, maintain the institutions of the state. I would always hope integrity. And while certain policies may change from time to time, I believe that basically the heart of the nation is sound, and if given the right leadership, will respond to that leadership.
And an addendum to that interview with Rodney Rice. Both men admitted after completing the interview that they had failed to talk about the blue shirt period in the early 1930s in Fine Gael's history. And this is what transpired.
There's an awful lot of nonsense about, you see, the blue shirts. First of all, they've got more publicity in recent years than they ever got at the time. What really happened with them was, this is a very brief thing, in the early years after Fianna Fáil got into office, they used to keep up, their supporters kicked up a lot of row at Fine Gael meetings, and a group called the Army Comrades were established to sort of make sure that they got a hearing. Now initially they wore, I gather, I don't know whether they wore anything, but at one stage they wore a little badge, but they found then, you go to a meeting and I go to a meeting, I didn't know you, and they were hitting each other at meetings, and then they started wearing the blue shirts, and that's how, as an identity. Yeah. But of course it got a lot of, and then towards the end of their time, there was a no rates campaign, and they started cutting telephone wires and knocking trees, some of them, and that was what put it out of court. But that was really the only, I mean, looking back on it, I was only young at the time, but I always understood, because even I remember one night, long after the blue shirts had ended, we were at a very rowdy meeting down in Chancery Place or somewhere, and we were drifting off in a lorry, but some of the fellas trying to get onto the lorry, who were supporters, were hit by fellas who were on the lorry and who thought they were charging and that kind of thing. But of course these things happen.
And next Sunday morning, more from the Liam Cosgrave archives. Liam Cosgrave as a public speaker at an Ard Fheis, especially when he abandoned his notes.
I don't know whether some of you do any hunting or not, but some of these commentators and critics are now like mongrel foxes, they're gone to ground. And I'll dig them out, and the pack will chop them when they get them.
And more from the Cosgrave archives next Sunday morning. This morning's programme was based on original programmes by Pat Feely, Colm Murray, Rodney Rice, Andy O'Mahony, Michael Campion, Murish McAneill, Barry Desmond, Maurice Manning, Stephen Collins and myself. More voices from the archives at the same time on Sunday morning next. Thank you for listening this morning, and good morning. But before we begin this morning, an apology to Eamon Morrissey, whose brilliant mimicry of Liam Cosgrave on Hall's Pictorial Weekly led me to an error last week when I managed to call him Liam Morrissey when using this sketch.
As you know, Mr. Hall, or Frank as I call him in private, missed no opportunity to give me a bit of publicity on the show.
Eamon Morrissey, of course. This morning we conclude our profile of Liam Cosgrave.
You know where I stand on law and order.
And also at that Ard Fheis of 1972, Liam Cosgrave made one of his most memorable and controversial speeches. He was essentially talking about those who had been, as he saw it, part-time politicians, whereas he himself...
And those of us who have spent our lives building up this party when we might have been more occupied personally to our advantage in either professional or business or other occupations.
This is his mongrel fox's speech, and he's just coming up to that point. But his audience kind of had little doubt that he was referring to Garrett Fitzgerald and Declan Costello.
But we have made it possible for them to come into the organisation and made it possible for them to squeak and to bleat about something that they know themselves they can't achieve.
Well, I think it helped, certainly.
This is Declan Costello, who had transformed Fine Gael with his radical policy paper, The Just Society.
And if you compared the publications of the policy programmes of the Fine Gael party and those in the Labour Party, there was very large areas of overlap.
I mean, it's very easy to caricature Liam Cosgrave as a Conservative, but when it came to the crunch point within Fine Gael in the row over the Just Society in 1965...
Maurice Manning, sometime Fine Gael TD and Senator.
When there was a clear division between James Dillon and Jerry Sweetman on the one hand and Declan Costello on the other, it was Liam Cosgrave who entered the battle on the side of Declan Costello.
This is taken from Andrew Mahony's programme on Liam Cosgrave in his series of assessments in the series Nothishig,
which swung the party around in favour of the Just Society. So Liam Cosgrave was never an ideologue, and if he liked an idea he'd go with it, and he was close to people. So the battle was never between two ideologies within the party. Declan Costello at that stage had earlier signalled his intention of leaving politics, and then he came back and ran, and I think Cosgrave just didn't have a place for him.
That's a reference to the fact that when Liam Cosgrave formed the Fine Gael Labour coalition in 1973, Declan Costello was not in the cabinet. He was at cabinet meetings, but he was Attorney General.
There were family tensions.
Barry Desmond did.
There were real family tensions because remember now, John A. Costello had made Liam Cosgrave a minister, and John A. Costello confidently expected that his son would be reciprocated by being made a minister.
Yeah,
and I've good reason to believe that John A. in the law library was incandescent at the fact that the son was offered the AG-ship, and I've been assured on reliable sources, Fine Gael sources I might add, that in fact John A. Costello advised Declan not to take the AG position. He was so annoyed about what Liam did.
Another surprise appointment in that Cosgrave-led coalition was that Garrett Fitzgerald, another of the mongrel foxes, was not made Minister for Finance, and his appointment was to Foreign Affairs.
Well, there always was a tension between Cosgrave and Fitzgerald, and I think it went right back to their parents, to their fathers.
Stephen Collins, author of The Cosgrave Legacy.
But I think political tensions developed during the 1960s. Garrett Fitzgerald was a liberal, he was on the liberal wing of the modernising wing, if you like, of Fine Gael. Liam Cosgrave was a traditionalist in many ways, and I think the two clashed both personality-wise and in terms of their thinking on major issues.
Well, of course, electioneering, it's almost impossible to decide in advance what's likely to happen.
Liam Cosgrave during the 1973 general election campaign.
At this stage, the reaction is very good. The public appear to be convinced that it's time for a change of government and that the policies which we have put before the people are realistic.
I think that the deal ultimately was following on the death of Gerard Sweetman.
Murish McAneel, who was appointed press secretary to that government in 1973.
At that funeral, it's reported that Brendan said to Liam, well, that's it, the problem is over. My impression was that, and that Liam Cosgrave and Brendan Corish between them carefully selected members of the government, including the attorney, who was an elected TD, and put Declan Costello in to reform, in fact, much of the law structure, including the establishment of the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Now, I know personally that I was very friendly with John A. Costello, who defended me, if I may say so, at the Money Lending Tribunal, and I discussed the matter and had to persuade him to the view that Declan Costello was best in the position he was now about to have as the attorney representing his department and government in the Dáil and answerable to the Dáil. And in fact, much of what happened subsequently in many respects to do with issues of tribunals and others would have been better resolved had the attorney been an elected member of the Dáil and sat in Parliament. And I think Liam Cosgrave took a very far-seeing view on the formation of each member of the nomination of each member of the government, and with Brendan Corish between them, put, in my view, a good team together for one purpose and one purpose only, so they would land safely at the other side of an election, whether they won or lost that subsequent election. And that's what they did.
But not without mishaps on the way.
I think that it's very unfortunate that the first time that the presidency has really come into the public gaze, except at election time.
Professor Basil Chubb on one of the biggest mishaps, the damage to the presidency when Cosgrave's Defence Minister Paddy Donegan called the President Carúla Dólig a thundering disgrace for referring an anti-terrorist bill to the Supreme Court to test its constitutionality.
Is over an issue where the functions of the President have been called in question, and where in fact then the role of the Constitution has been called in the role of the President in the Constitution, and indeed the function of the Constitution, because the function of the Constitution, or one of its functions, is to govern the government, and one of the triggers of this is the President with this power and duty to refer bills. And on this occasion, this reference has been challenged in such a way as to suggest that it was a wrong thing to do. So just at the point at which the Constitution should be operating, and there must be very few lawyers anyway who don't believe that this was a proper reference, it was called in question in a very rough sort of way. And I think, therefore, this is a very real crisis, because it's a crisis, really, of constitutional government.
I think if he had asked Paddy Donegan to resign, Paddy Donegan would very happily have done so.
Maurice Manning.
And if the resignation wasn't there, yes, he should have been fired. But that was one of Liam Cosgrave's maybe a problem, that he was in some ways very loyal to those he regarded as loyal to him, and he had no more loyal member of the cabinet than Paddy Donegan, and it was a bad error of judgment.
Maurice Manning.
I think sometimes it's a question of personal chemistry as well.
Oh, yes.
There was no personal chemistry between Liam Cosgrave and Paddy Donegan.
What were the roots of that?
Had it been Paddy Hillary, I suspect.
Yeah. What were the roots of that bad relation, bad vibe?
Well, I think they didn't get on. Carol O'Donnell, I think, described himself as an old Fenian. I think to his friends. I think he came from that tradition. He himself and Liam Cosgrave didn't see eye to eye. Cosgrave, I think, as Taoiseach, didn't really know how to deal with the President either, because there was no personal chemistry. He was not inclined to go very often to Áras Nuachtarán to brief the President. And I think the President maybe felt slighted.
I am almost certain in my mind, apart from what it is that Maurice Manning has said, that actually the office of the President did not seriously impact on the work of the Taoiseach then or previously. And even when the late Erskine Childers became President, this turned out to be a problem. How to actually deal with a President who was now about to be active, as distinct from the former President De Valera, who had remained essentially somnolent and quiet about the matter. And suddenly this new thing arrived in the middle of a major crisis concerning a number of things, which ended with the murder of the British ambassador, and the government was preoccupied with that, and I frankly think they overlooked the role of the President. As we now imagine, particularly from the election of President Robinson, one can see how horrendous this might now seem.
Whereas you didn't have that tradition of a hands-on President at the time.
And you also had a context, I think, of, as Murish was saying, of the violence. With the murder of the British ambassador was a shocking event.
76,
in 1976, and the legislation produced by the government was a response to that. So the President then referred this emergency legislation.
Was there much tension, Barry, within the Cabinet, by the way, overall, as to how to deal with these dreadful events that were occurring?
No, not a great deal, no. For example, when Tita Herrema was kidnapped, and when those who kidnapped him threatened to assassinate him, to kill him, unless Rose Dugdale and a few others were released, the government was absolutely unanimous in its firmness against any concession.
Did you not have a civil liberties constituency within that government?
Well, at that time, remember now, you had the assassination of the British ambassador in 1976, you had the Dublin bombs in 74, 34.
So the whole climate
was one of, we are not going to bend our knee to the terrorists in either north or south, or coming north to the south or whatever. And to that extent there was, but unfortunately Carol O'Donnell, who'd just come home from the European Court of Justice, where he was a very active member, was above in virtual isolation in the park. I was a member of the Council of State. The man, I met him on several occasions outside of those meetings, and I got a distinct impression that he was bored and looking for something to do.
Why did Cosgrave call the election 9 months before he had to? Warish, what's your thinking on that?
I wasn't working in the civil service at that point.
Yes, but I realise that. But
I suspected that there's a so-called chattering class within the government as well, who actually began to feel uneasy and moved him against his best judgment, in my view, to bring forward the election.
On what grounds?
I just think they became uneasy about the length of time they were in office and began to seize the opportunity, and that talk built up
but
internally.
You had this extraordinary stories in your book, Stephen, about an opinion poll coming out very, very shortly.
Fine Gael commissioned an opinion poll immediately Liam Cosgrave called the election. And they got the results in a couple of days. Jack Jones of MRBI came in and told them they were going to be destroyed. Fianna Fáil was on 59%, I think, in that opinion poll. So the elementary precaution of commissioning the opinion poll at least first was ignored.
And if I remember rightly, there was a subsequent opinion poll that was slightly more favourable to
slightly more favourable. And actually, you could argue they narrowed the gap by they reduced Fianna Fáil's lead, but Fianna Fáil's lead was so great.
The election call at that time, Maurice Manning.
The election call was a mystery. Because Fine Gael was totally unprepared. I can't speak for Labour, but Fine Gael was utterly and totally unprepared. It only appointed its press officer about 4 or 5 days after the election had been called. It had no structure, no headquarters, it had no election strategy. And normally the government in power is in a position, since it picks the date, to have its campaign strategy ready, its posters ready and so forth. So why the election was called is a mystery.
And actually they shed their party interest. It has to be said about this government. They shed their party interest in favour of government unity.
Was it the best coalition government we've ever seen?
Yes. Yes, it faced into everything, including social matters, the economy, the North, political. Every part of it was done into. It was a reforming government. Michael O'Leary's legislative record in the matter of labour law alone stands a record, not to mention what it is that Declan Costello did during his short period as the attorney, and the whole Sunningdale matter, on top of all sorts of other things, and our membership of the European Community, and our first presidency for Ireland, and the handling of all of that, with ministers having to be in Brussels and Dublin. But it was an extraordinary experience.
It seems to be two things, as if the ground was cleared first, and then you're the personal chemistry of coalition.
What you've got to realise that was, in those 4 years, I don't believe that any Irish Taoiseach has ever had to deal with the appalling events that happened within those 4 years.
Maureen de Burke.
All sort of clumped in together, if you like.
Even putting the oil prices to one side.
Absolutely. Guards were killed. A TD was murdered.
Yes.
There were guns ran into the bay or something. I mean, there was a whole series of things, and there had never been. These two parties had never worked together. Now, I'm not. I wouldn't. I would have been anti-coalition at the time. I didn't think that Labour should have gone in, particularly with Fine Gael, for God's sake. But if you looking at it from hindsight, they did extremely well under the circumstances, and they did prove, as Marisha said, that coalitions can work. Up to that, we had been brainwashed into believing that you had a one-party government.
Some reflections on the Liam Cosgrave-led Fine Gael Labour government of 1973 to 1977, concluding our coverage of Liam Cosgrave from the archives. When he lost power in the 1977 election, he immediately resigned the Fine Gael leadership and was succeeded by Garrett Fitzgerald. And Liam Cosgrave died some 40 years later, just earlier this month.